Welcome back. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and across the country, people are paying tribute to the 9 men and women who were murdered Wednesday night inside Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Last night, thousands attended a vigil of prayer and solidarity at an arena in Charleston. Also yesterday, there were profound moments of grace when one by one, family members of the Mother Emanuel victims stood in a courtroom and offered forgiveness to the man charged with killing their loved ones. The man police say confessed to the massacre remains behind bars this morning. Joining me now from the Charleston County Detention Center in North Charleston, South Carolina, is MSNBC national reporter Trymaine Lee. Trymaine, what is next for Mr. Roof?
This is the beginning of a very long process. Again, just the beginning. Yesterday, when a magistrate judge set a $1 million bond on the gun charge, he said that he did not have the authority to issue, to set bail on the 9 murder charges he faces. That'd be left to a state circuit court. And so in the coming days or weeks, we'll figure out when that will happen. But also, as we learned from the affidavit last night, that he uttered some sort of racially inflammatory statement before leaving the church. So now that may be fodder for a civil rights investigation by the Department of Justice. They'll be looking at this as a possible hate crime. But for the time being, again, he is behind us in this detention center. And again, the beginning of a very long road.
Yeah, Department of Justice indicating that they're considering all avenues, including a hate crime and domestic terror as possibilities. Of course, also in addition just to the murder charges for these 9. Thank you to MSNBC's Trymaine Lee in North Charleston, South Carolina. Following Wednesday's massacre at Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston, South Carolina, the devastation and sense of loss was palpable. The tragedy was called an unspeakable act and a heartbreaking act. Headlines read, "Loner held in church killings." On Friday, the Department of Justice discussed its investigation in stark terms, and the spokesperson for the DOJ said, quote, "The department is looking at this crime from all angles, including as a hate crime and as an act of domestic terrorism." Hate crime. Domestic terrorism. 2 terms to describe the massacre that have eluded some GOP candidates, with many of their initial statements and comments failing to mention race at all. When first asked if he believed the shooting was racially motivated, Jeb Bush replied, "I don't know what was on the mind or the heart of the man who committed these atrocious crimes." Speaking at the Faith and Freedom Coalition, Senator Rand Paul believed that he had the answer.
What kind of person goes in a church and shoots 9 people? There's a sickness in our country. There's something terribly wrong, but it isn't going to be fixed by your government. It's people straying away. It's people not understanding where salvation comes from. And I think that if we understand that, we'll understand and have better expectations of what we get from our government.
And finally, Rick Santorum had this to say.
You talk about the importance of prayer at this time, but
Yes.
we're now seeing assaults on religious liberty that we've never seen before. So it's a time for real deeper reflection, even beyond this horrible situation.
At the table, Dr. Jonathan Metzl, director for the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society, as well as professor of psychiatry at Vanderbilt University. Yolanda Pierce, associate professor of African American religion and literature at the Princeton Theological Seminary. Akil Reed Amar Sterling, professor of law and political science at Yale University and author of The Law of the Land, a grand tour of our constitutional republic. And Joe Watkins, a Republican strategist and former White House aide to President George H.W. Bush. So I want to start with you, Joe, just because there is no question every single GOP candidate denounced this as a horrible crime, as something disgusting and awful and tragic. But it also seems to me that where we, like, how we understand what a thing like this is helps to convey something about sort of what we think the problems are in American society. And we did not hear a racial analysis, at least initially, from these candidates.
Well, we should have. I think that they should have called it what it was, which was a hate crime, a crime based on race and the color of a person's skin. And they ought to just speak plainly about it. I'm a Republican. I worked for a Republican president. And I also happen to be an African American. I'm somebody who has to deal with what other African American men have to deal with every single day.
Yep.
And it was racial hatred. And I think Republican candidates are much smarter if they talk about it plainly and clearly to other Americans.
I wondered if it was a little bit of the John McCain effect, where, GOP hopefuls maybe recognizing that there's an early South Carolina primary that will occur, and that John McCain got himself into trouble 15 years ago. I thought it might be worth taking a listen.
But they fought to sever the union of our great nation, a cause that would have terribly harmed America, perhaps irreparably, and for a time at least perpetuated the grave injustice of slavery. They fought on the wrong side of American history. That, my friends, is how I personally feel about the Confederate battle flag. That is the honest answer I never gave to a fair question. I feared that if I answered honestly, I could not win the South Carolina primary.
I mean, he was about saying it plain. He said, I didn't give the real answer. This is what I think about it.
Right, and he's right. He should have just told it the way it was. I mean, people respect you if you're true to yourself and if you speak the truth.
I want to go, Akil, to this idea of the individual loner shooter somehow disconnected from a history of American race. Because I asked you when you came in, you're wearing a tie that has Abraham Lincoln on it, and you gave me a linkage, an analysis that I thought might be useful to share here.
So we're talking about the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, basically co-founded by Lincoln, and we're talking about South Carolina and the Confederacy and the history. Lincoln was assassinated. He was killed by someone who was a narcissistic murderer, but was also politically motivated, was part of a larger ideology of hate and hierarchy. Abraham Lincoln is killed by John Wilkes Booth 4 days after Lincoln, for the first time in the White House, publicly says, I, Abraham Lincoln, think black people should vote. And John Wilkes Booth was in the audience when he heard that, and he actually said, according to reliable reports, that's the last speech he will ever give. And that's history, that's context, and it's complicated. It's complicated in all sorts of ways, but let's understand the history and the context.
But that idea that there is not a mutually exclusive relationship between a narcissistic murderer who is also imbued with the system of racial supremacy, of white supremacy in this.
Well, this narrative of the loner, again, is something we hear in the aftermath of pretty much every one of these shootings. It's perpetuated in some ways by the media, but also the NRA very often says, this is a lone act, this is one crazy person. Yeah. And what that does is it doesn't allow society to look at itself. I feel like we go the wrong way when we tell that narrative, because these are moments of national awakening about ourselves, about our own values. This shooter clearly reflected larger ideologies. He clearly resonated with larger symbols of racism. I mean, I don't think having a flag of Rhodesia was necessarily the best approach for him, given the history, but I think that in a way, this is a reflection of us. This is a shooting that the pathology is us in a way at these moments. And we really do a disservice when we individuate it.
I was going to say that lone wolf narrative, the reason why it bothers me is that, of course, within, 12 or 24 hours, they've interviewed his friends, his neighbors, his family members. So he's not a lone wolf. He is situated in a community, and a community is in part connected to the heinous act. We can't dismiss this as an anomaly or an aberration. I even don't like when we say this was a senseless crime. Actually, it makes perfect sense, right? Racism in this country is as ubiquitous as rain. And so it actually makes perfect sense. So instead of saying this is a lone wolf or this is someone who we just can't imagine, well, he told us why he did what he did. And he told us who he hated. And he told us why. And so we have to take that seriously, so we stop thinking that, oh, this is just an individual and it won't happen again. It happens with a great degree of regularity. It's broken. Our systems are broken. Our institutions and our structures are racist. And until we address that, we're going to continue to have these conversations at tables like this.
Here's one thing that we've done historically when these horrible things have happened. Americans, amazingly, have made constitutional lemonade out of lemons. Lincoln is martyred, and we get the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment in his memory of his vision. And these 4 little girls are killed in a bomb in
get the
Birmingham,
Civil Rights
Alabama, and we get the Civil Rights Act of six, and President Kennedy is assassinated, and in his name,
Yes.
Lyndon Johnson says we must have civil rights and voting rights, and Martin King is assassinated, and the day after that, I believe, the Supreme Court hears a landmark Fair Housing Act case, Jones versus Alfred Mayer, and ringingly affirms the importance of fair housing in America. So we have in American history taken these horrible moments, use them as occasions to reflect on ourselves and actually make amends.
I'm just tired of that being
Yeah.
done on the backs of black people.
Right.
And that's what we have to say. Those occasions certainly have happened, but primarily on the backs of black people.
But
Enough is enough.
And let me just suggest that one place where we haven't yet done it is in the question of the deaths, the martyrs, children at Sandy Hook. And we have not made reasonable accommodations around the question of gun control. And when we come back, I'm going to talk to Lucia McBath, the mother of Jordan Davis.